I'm Mike DeLuca. Welcome to this rare in-the-trenches look at the craft of screenwriting. Today I'm joined by Nick Kazan, who's written the screenplays for At Close Range, Fallen, Enough, and Reversal of Fortune, for which he earned an Oscar nomination. He also wrote and directed the 1994 thriller Dream Lover and adapted the Roald Dahl novel Matilda with his screenwriter wife, Robin Swicord. Nick, thanks for being here.
My pleasure, Mike.
Now, how did you get your start in screenwriting?
Well, I got my start. I don't even know how to answer that. I'll tell you the thing which made me a writer. I dropped out of college for 2 years. Prior to dropping out, I wrote a play. The play was done in college. While I was out of college, I wrote a lot of short stories. My mother had been a failed writer. I felt that I might want to be a writer. When I was back in college as a senior, I went back to avoid going to jail or going to Vietnam. Right. I went to see a short play by Harold Pinter. I came home the next day and I heard a line of dialogue in my head and I went and wrote it down. And I got up an hour and a half later and I went in the other room. My wife was there and she said, "What were you typing?" And I said, "I just wrote a play, but I can't tell you what it was about. I have no idea what I just wrote." And then I rested and I had a cup of coffee and I went back in and I rewrote it. But prior to returning to the room, I had no idea what it was.
Like an out-of-body writing experience.
Out-of-body writing experience. Well, it so happens that last year, the previous year, Pinter won the Nobel Prize. And he writes the same way. This is what I found out. I'm going to quote from his Nobel speech.
Okay.
I would try to paraphrase, but it's Harold Pinter. He says, "Most of my plays are engendered by a line, a word, or an image. The first line of The Homecoming is, 'What have you done with the scissors?' I had no further information. Someone was obviously looking for a pair of scissors and was demanding their whereabouts of someone else he suspected had probably stolen them." And he says, "I always start a play by calling the characters A, B, and C. In the play that became The Homecoming, I saw a man enter a stark room and ask his question of a younger man sitting on an ugly sofa reading a racing paper. I somehow suspected that A was a father and B was his son, but I had no proof. This was, however, confirmed a short time later when B, later to become Lenny, says to A, later to become Max, 'Dad, do you mind if I change the subject?'" So here, it was remarkable to me to find out so many years later that Pinter actually wrote his plays exactly as I wrote that first play.
That's amazing. So did it strike you as wild that you kind of had the same process as Harold Pinter?
The same process
or lack of a process, kind of inspirational.
Yes, it was truly like what, the Greeks and others would talk about in terms of a muse. It was like I'd been visited. Well, that experience made me a writer. I felt I was called. I felt I was claimed. I didn't know, how I would do it, but I felt I had to do it.
You didn't know where it was going to lead?
And this play was done in college, and then it was done professionally at the Magic Theater, which was then in Berkeley and later moved to San Francisco, and they did all Shepard's plays and so forth. So I went on writing plays. Eventually, I moved to Los Angeles, and I was writing movie scripts as well, some with friends. I wrote a great many of them, 10, 15, 20, I don't know how many I wrote before I had any success. And then one day, I read an article by Michael Goodwin in the Village Voice about Texas Chainsaw Massacres. Well, I grew up in New York City. I went to a high-toned college. So I have, I can be a little bit of a snob. Texas Chainsaw Massacres is not a film I normally would have gone to see. But I read this article in which he talked about how film functions like dream, and about how this movie was very scary and very funny, the way dreams are. And I had to go out and see the movie. I went and saw the movie, and I came home, and I had an idea. And in 4 or 5 days, I wrote a script which had the same feeling, same ethos as Texas Chainsaw Massacres. Well, I finished the script, and I put it in, and I read it over, and I thought, this is horrifying, and I put it in my drawer. And I went about working on other things, And about a month later, I said, I should take a look at that script. Maybe it wasn't quite as terrible as I thought. And it was a script that had very little dialogue in it. It was mostly visual, and what dialogue it had was sort of peculiar, Pinteresque in a way, but also Chainsaw Massacre-esque in a way. And
it's an unholy alliance. But I bet it was excellent.
Well, I took it out and read it, and I thought, this is pretty good. And I gave it to my agent, who represented one of the top horror directors in town, and he didn't like it. I gave it to my friends, and they said, this is a lot better than your other scripts. And I said, yeah, I know. And I changed agents, found another agent, and I sold that script. And that's how I became a screenwriter, really, is that I had two experiences which formed me. One as a playwright, and the second as a screenwriter. And in both cases, there was a kind of automatic writing quality to them.
What's the name of the first script?
My script was called Animals. It was turned into a film that I took my name off of. I took my name off my first produced film. And so I'm not going to tell you the name of it because I didn't like it. It was a peculiar circumstance. I went in, I loved this script and I knew it was good. I went in to meet with the executive and I said, before I go ahead with the deal, I want to find out what your notes are because I want to know what you want to do with it. And he told me his notes, and there were just a few notes and they were fine. Then we went ahead and made the deal. I went in for a second meeting and the list of notes was voluminous. So I went to my lawyer and I said, all we have is a verbal contract. The verbal contract is based on verbal assurances which turn out to be lies. Can't we void the contract? And he called them up and they said, we have lawyers on staff. That was the response.
That's a chilling line.
Yes. In other words, my script would be tied up in litigation forever. I could never sell it to anyone else. My legal bills would be, enormous, and I would see nothing from it. So I went ahead with the sale. They hired another writer. I was rewritten. I took my name off.
So you were kind of bullied into that experience, but did it color kind of your view of Hollywood, or was it just thankfully an isolated incident?
Well, I worked with Marvin Worth, who produced Lenny and a lot of other films.
Sure.
A very colorful character. He was a good friend of Malcolm X's, and he had an enormous coat at one time, and he had many pockets inside each side of it, with different pills in each pocket. He was like a walking drugstore. He had long hair. He always dressed in zoot suits. He was a fabulous character. Marvin said, you get fucked in Hollywood, he said. And when you get fucked, you say, I'm never going to let them do that to me again. He said, but the thing about Hollywood is they got so many different ways to fuck you, you can never escape.
You can't anticipate all the ways they're going to come at you.
Anticipate all the ways.
Well, apart from that experience where it clicked creatively for you, was there a later point where it really clicked business-wise for you? And was there one screenplay that kind of broke through the ceiling for you?
Well, after I wrote that screenplay, I got to work on Francis, which was a wonderful experience, but the script that really changed my status in Hollywood was At Close Range, from which we'll look at a clip later. That script did me an enormous amount of good initially as people read it and it circulated, and it was written more or less in the same style as the first script that I mentioned. But it was not until that script was produced that things really changed, because until your script is produced, you're like a virgin, it's like you're a pretty girl, but you don't put out. But once they know that the film is worth making, that somebody else has invested the money in it, that really changes things. So that was the script that changed everything.
Well, I remember when that film was coming out, there was a kind of electrifying buzz about it. It was a very anticipated movie at the time. Yeah,
it was, and unfortunately it was financed by Hemdale, who then was tied up in various forms of litigation, so the film never got a proper release. So, it had a reputation here in Hollywood, and
the life it's continued to have among, fans of any type of film, but just, film buffs in general. It's really a testament. What do you think prepared you most to be a screenwriter?
Just going to movies. I just love movies. I mean, I never studied writing. I never studied screenwriting. I didn't go to film school. I just, I hear voices and I see visions. And instead of being locked up, I'm a screenwriter.
You picked the good option.
Yes, exactly.
Do you think it's possible to write towards being commercial? Is that ever a consideration in your work, or do you just kind of let the chips fall where they may?
If I'm excited by two ideas and one feels commercial and the other doesn't, I'm more likely to write the commercial one. But, I met with Alan Horn a year or so ago, and he said, people talk about commercial, but it's impossible to predict what'll be commercial. If someone pitched you the idea of a beautiful mind, would you think that was necessarily commercial? In the right hands, done in the right way, an idea can be commercial, and the same idea in the wrong hands, done in the wrong way, no one will go see it. And so, I think that the most important thing is to write something that you passionately believe in, that you see really specifically.
And be true to that.
And be true to that. And if you can do that, then other people will respond. And, the most unlikely thing could turn out to be very commercial.
And do you kind of beat out, I think you've answered this already, but do you beat out a story in advance of writing it, or do you still hear that voice and just kind of, rush through it?
Things really vary. I can spend as little as a few days or as much as 6 months preparing to write a script. When I actually write the script, I like to do it quickly because I feel that the energy of doing it quickly is transmitted to the reader. The reader feels that, and the reader is carried along by the speed of it. I have learned through making mistakes over and over again that if I reach a point where a tiny bell goes off, that I might be going in the wrong direction, to stop. It's very painful to stop, but if you don't stop, then you're going to reach the end, that you're going to hear that bell a little louder, you're going to realize that you have a very substantial problem, and then you're going to have to amputate a limb. And in my experience, it's like, people talking about amputees. You always, if somebody had a third arm and you cut it off, they're always going to feel the third arm. If you have a real problem and you build it into the fabric of your piece, people are going to sense it. I mentioned earlier this film with Patty Hearst. Paul Schrader directed it. He made a very austere film. My script was a wacko comedy. A very dark comedy, but it was a comedy. Paul would go through the script and say, people might laugh at this. And I'd say, well, yeah, that was the idea. And he'd say, I think if you just invert these two words, you won't get a laugh. So I would change the words because he didn't want to make a comedy. Paul was taking the comedy out and making a very austere film about identity, and I think he made quite a good film. Not the film that I envisioned, but he made a good film. The reviewer for the LA Times reviewed the film as if it were a black comedy. The reviewer could feel what I had under the surface. So even though Paul was fighting it all the way, this guy could feel what was underneath.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah,
so it kind of came through anyway.
Yeah, I think that there's something in the DNA of a script that it can't be taken out, which is why in the development process, you're frequently told, make this man a woman, make this person black. It's like, and there are things that you can do that don't screw with the DNA, but there are other things that will screw it up, and those are things you have to fight as a writer.
Your writing has such authenticity to it. How do you approach writing things that you don't have any first-hand experience with such kind of authenticity? Do you do a lot of research?
Well, in some cases, in Reversal of Fortune, I read thousands of pages of trial transcripts, and I discovered things about the case that no one else knew, essentially. Human things that other people, that lawyers wouldn't have paid any attention to. On At Close Range, I went and I hung out with some members of the gang that Chris Walken's character, that the real guy, people who were in his gang.
So that was useful to pick up the dialogue and kind of the cadence of the speech.
Exactly, the cadence of the speech. you go to see a movie and you're with the movie and it's exciting and you're following it, and then all of a sudden you go, oh, I just left the movie. You know, one of the reasons that I will spend as long as 6 months preparing to write a script is because I don't want to fake it.
And is that 6 months spent doing a formal outline, or is it going to take different forms?
I'll come back to that in a sec. You know, it's like, and if I have an original idea, I can have the genesis of the idea, I can know the end, but if I don't know quite how to get there, I want to feel that I have all the necessary steps in place before I start, so that I don't do anything that's phony, because you know, you get thrown out of a movie so easily.
And you always know where it's going.
You always know where it's going. I mean, in terms of my process, I don't use cards. I begin, when I write notes, when I prepare to write a script, I'm writing dialogue. Some of it I'm just hearing. Sometimes I don't know who's talking yet, so it's analogous to that original experience that I had. I've written, you know, 5-page scenes preparing to write a script, and I don't know who's saying the words yet. And so often that stuff gets thrown out, but sometimes it goes in the movie word for word. It's part of the process, of course, is character analysis, developing characters, and part of it is writing outlines. And I will write an outline, you know, 10 days into starting to think about a script, and then I'll get 30 pages into the script, and then I won't know what happens next, and I'll just stop. And then a month later or 2 weeks later, I'll start a new outline. And I won't look at the other outline, and I'll go as far as I can go. There comes a point when I reach critical mass where I have to write the script, and I just can't. And I try to frustrate myself as much as I can, so that when I do write the script, the energy that I've built up is really intense.
And not diluted, kind of just like a burst appendix almost.
Exactly. Yes, no burst appendix.
How do you approach writing for women? Do you have to do separate or extra research for writing female characters? Because you've written really strong women.
You know, when I started out as a playwright, somebody said, you know, said to me, you write women so well. So I responded to that by writing a play with no women in it, because I was pissed off. But you know, I don't think that there's any, you know, women are people, men are people. I love women, I'm interested in them. And every once in a while, I'll write a script, and my wife or some other woman who reads it will say, you know, I don't think a woman would do that. And then I have to think about that, you know, but I don't know what I would do to do more research. I don't know how I would begin to do that.
And do you ever read other screenplays kind of in town just to see what's going on, or is that ever helpful?
Well, every once in a while you read something, and I'm trying to think of an example, but every once in a while you read something and you think, oh my God, that's beautifully done. I mean, there's something that my wife does in her screenplays that's just a way of telling you what the subtext is in a very economical way. You pick things up. I mean, I do something in my screenplays that I've seen other people start to do, which is interesting, which is when I was having my movies made, I was frustrated because if an actor got interrupted, he would say the rest of the line, and often what he would make up for the rest of the line was preposterous and actually change the meaning of the line, which showed the actor didn't understand the line to begin with, and the screenplay just for a moment veered off in the wrong direction. So I started to put in, after someone's interrupted, I would put in parentheses what he was going to say. So if he didn't get interrupted, at least he would be going in the right direction and saying the right thing. And I've seen other writers pick this up. So I think that
So you're the source of parentheticals.
I am the source of parentheticals. Yes.
It comes in handy, I'm sure.
It does, yeah.
Did any of this kind of precipitate your own decision to direct, or is that going to be something you're going to continue?
You know, I directed a short for HBO, which I had a great time with. The movie I directed, we had a lot of problems with. And part of the problems were that the movie didn't test well. They wanted to put a different ending on. They hired another writer to write a different ending, which was really inelegant and kind of preposterous. And I got saved from that. I refused to shoot it, so I was told I would be sued. So I had to direct this ending that I didn't believe in.
Again with the lawyers.
again with the lawyers, well, it was kind of stupid because how well are you going to direct something you don't believe in? You know, not probably tremendously well. And my agreement was that we would test both endings and so forth. Well, the leading lady in the film, Mädchen Amick, who was fabulous in the movie, got pregnant between the original shoot and the reshoots. And when it came time to do the reshoots, she couldn't continue. And they thought that she was, sabotaging their reshoots, but in fact she had, went to many doctors and they all verified that she had complications of pregnancy. And finally they just said, well, the hell with it, we'll just release the movie. But it was very frustrating. Even the release was frustrating because, Siskel and Ebert gave it 2 thumbs up. We got a lot of, they said, if you get good reviews, we'll push the movie. I got really good review in the New York Times. I got 2 thumbs up and they didn't push the movie. And then they said, if you do well the first weekend, we did well and they still didn't push it. So it was, in that sense, it was another typical experience, a Marvin Worth experience.
Do you think you'll return to it though?
I may. There are a couple of, there are things that there's one, I'm interested in doing things that are kind of small and odd to direct. So, if I get in the right circumstance with the right script, I will.
How important are those first lines of dialogue for any character you're writing? Does it kind of set the tone for the rest of the piece?
Well, if the lines are good, I don't know. I don't think about the entrance. Right. Sometimes I think about the first scene in a screenplay. That has to be right. But what I like to do with a character is, this is kind of related to your question. What I like to do with a character is, if it's a minor character who I know, like somebody's father is going to come in, I like to not know who it's going to be. I like to have the door open. You open the door, and the father comes in, and he's going to tell his daughter that her mother's dead. And the door opens, and there's a midget there. And it's the last thing you expect, is the midget, and then you play the scene with the midget, and then you look at it and you say, that doesn't work. And you say, that's too comic, or it's too peculiar. Say, okay, go out, shut the door again, and have somebody else walk in, and it's a guy with long, stringy blonde hair and bad teeth. And then it's a different character, and you have that character do it, and you play with it in that way. So I like to preserve those things, as opportunities, because I think that the more spontaneous the script is, the more unexpected it is for you as a writer, the more alive it is for the reader.
So it's kind of like trial by error, or like monkey wrenching it a little bit to see
exactly.
what works.
And if I can have that experience like Pinter, where I'm just hearing it, or the experience I had writing that first script where I'm having visions, that's the ideal thing. That doesn't always happen because, as you know, screenplays are very much about construction, and it has to work and it has to progress. You can't have too many deviations from the norm.
Does structure play a big part in your kind of outlining process? Do you kind of have your 10 poles set up where you know where those structural beats are going to be, or you kind of hit those as you go?
I do it entirely by feel. Sometimes I have a lot of trouble with structure as a result, but I just try to proceed, and I know the movie has to intensify. I don't like to bore people. If I'm in this interview and I feel like you're getting bored, I'm out the door. Well, I'm the same way as a writer.
Don't leave.
I don't want to bore the audience. So I'll do anything, the most absurd things to keep people's attention.
Now, did you feel constrained when you had to do things that were based on real life events? Did that process
No, it's exciting because when you're doing an original screenplay and you're making the whole thing up, it's can be very intricate and difficult, and you're creating a whole world. Fallen is, I had one friend who said to me, that's based on a novel, right? I said, no. He said, you made that entire thing up? And I said, yeah. He said, it's a lot to make up. I said, yeah, I know. When you have a real movie, a script based on real events, as in At Close Range, for instance, there were certain events that had to be in the movie.
That you knew were going to be there regardless.
They knew were going to be there. There were certain real lines of dialogue from the underlying stories in the Philadelphia Inquirer. There were certain underlying moments when this character took one of the boys and the boy said such and such. You know those are going to be in the movie. So then you say, fantastic, I know those things are there. And they exist kind of as the architecture of your building. You know that wall is going to be there. And even though you might like it further back, that's where it's going to be. And you play with it. You say, okay, what's the most interesting way that I can put that wall there?
And what can you put around it?
What can I put around it? Do I build a false wall in front of it so there's a little passageway between the two walls? That would be exciting. It's like, there are lots of different ways you can use it, but you know that you have these things, and then your imagination can be completely free within the constraints of those givens.
Oh, it sounds like it could actually be a liberating experience.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you have a favorite line of dialogue you've ever written, true story or not true story, just one that stands out?
Well, I do, but I can't say it because I want to use it, and it was cut from the thing that
So we'll be hearing it soon at some point.
You'll be hearing it soon,
okay,
yeah.
Fair enough.
I always say, and perhaps I shouldn't say this, but I always say that the most exciting part of most movies is the leader, is the blank screen before the first image comes up. Because in that moment, anything could happen. You could have a transformative experience. You could be seeing The Godfather. You could be seeing Best of Youth. You could be seeing Texas Chainsaw Massacres. You could be seeing something that's unlike anything you've ever seen before. And that just...
That moment of anticipation where everything's up for grabs.
Moment of anticipation. And what I try to do, and I don't succeed, but it's what motivates me, is to write something that's unlike any film that you've seen before. And obviously you can't do that, but you can think of something conceptual that hasn't been done. And I'm playing around with various ideas that are different. And so a lot of them are much more difficult to get made because, as you know, people are scared of what's new.
Right.
They're scared of anything which is different. But that's what excites me as a writer.
Had you always been kind of a fan of the horror genre, even before you wrote Fallen, and based on your first script and your Texas Chainsaw?
Well, I love to be scared. I love roller coasters. Mm-hmm. And I think that, I love Hitchcock. I love Clouseau. I think we love to be scared. We love to feel anything. And my imagination always goes to the catastrophic. I just saw this film, an Australian film called Look Both Ways, which I think just opened in New York. And in this film...
It's already kind of a foreboding title.
Yeah, well, it's about, trains. Look both ways before you cross the tracks. And this girl in the movie, they flash to her fantasies, and in her fantasies, they do it with drawings. Mm-hmm. So she'll be walking along next to the train, and suddenly you'll hear a horrible noise, and you'll go to animation, and you'll see the train hurtling off the tracks and falling on her.
Oh, what a wonderful effect.
And then you go back to her, and she's just walking along. She looks up the train going by. And and there's one catastrophic event after another happening in her imagination in the first 15 minutes. And I turned to my wife and said, that's me, that's what I do. I'm walking down the street and I have a catastrophic fantasy of some kind. And so one of the ways that I release my anxiety is by writing. When I was writing At Close Range, which is a movie I did not want to write initially, my friend Elliot Lewitt came to me with this story, and I said, it's about a man murdering his children. I don't want to write that. And he kept talking to me about how it was like Greek tragedy and on and on and on. And finally, one day, it clicked. It just changed from something that I really didn't want to do to something that I really had to do. And that's when I know that I have to write something. Anyway, when I was writing this horrible movie, or this story that at its best was like Greek tragedy, but about these horrible events, I was in the best possible mood. I had my dreams were clear.
It was on the page, out of your head.
On the page, and any anxiety I had, I didn't have to walk around with catastrophic fantasies because they were all on the page. Well, likewise, other things that I've written, and certainly, I don't only write that way. I like to write different kinds of things, but that's fun for me.
And how important is discipline to kind of your working habits? Do you have like a set schedule that you stick to?
Yes, I do, and one of the problems I had with directing was that it was very hard for me after directing to go back in my room and write, because I would look out and the world, it was a beautiful day. There's so many other things you can do with one's life. Essentially, as a writer, I have to go to work almost every day, at least 5 days a week. If I'm writing a first draft, I'm writing every day, and go down and go to work by 9, 10 at the latest. I don't do lunches. If somebody habitually goes to lunch, I say they're not a writer, because how can you have lunch if you're a writer? You start worrying about that you're going to forget the lunch, and then you can't come back after a 2-hour lunch and go back to work. You're not in the same place. So I go down to my office and I work. I have lunch at my desk. I work till 3 or 4. And then I stop. And once in a while, I'll come back and work at night if I want to write something which is very emotional, where I want sort of to fall apart. Then I'll come back and write it when I'm tired. But otherwise, I write with the first energy of the day.
Oh, that's interesting. So, are there other besides fatigue? Are there other elements you use in your writing process to kind of get in the mood for certain things, like music or
yes,
the location of where you're writing?
I use classical music, Gregorian chants, anything that sort of keeps me calm and drowns out the rest of the world.